My name is Garrett Blackwood. I'm a lumberjack who survived the first 24 hours of the zombie outbreak that destroyed civilization. In one day, I watched my neighbor transform into a flesh-eating monster, witnessed an entire town fall to the infected, and had to make impossible choices to save a family trapped in hell. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a survival story. It's a warning about how quickly everything you know can disappear. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Garrett Blackwood, and I'm a lumberjack who survived the first 24 hours of the zombie outbreak that destroyed civilization. What I'm about to tell you happened exactly 72 hours ago, and I might be one of the last people who witnessed how it all began. This isn't just another survival story you'll hear on the internet. This is a warning about how quickly everything you think you know can crumble into nothing. I've been working the forests of the Pacific Northwest for 12 years now, ever since I left the Warm Springs Reservation when I was 22. My Cherokee grandfather used to tell me that the forest speaks to those who know how to listen, and after more than a decade of cutting timber in these mountains, I thought I understood what he meant. Trees have their own language. The way Douglas firs creak before they fall, how the wind changes direction when a storm's coming, the silence that settles over everything when danger is near. I thought I knew what danger looked like after dodging falling trees and operating chainsaws for over a decade. I was wrong. October 15th, 2024 started like every other Tuesday morning for the past 12 years. My alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, just like it had every workday since I started with Cascade Timber Solutions. My cabin sits about 30 miles northeast of Seattle, tucked away in the mountains near the small logging town of Granite Falls. It's isolated, which is exactly how I like it. No neighbors close enough to complain about my chainsaw practice at dawn. No city noise. Just me and the forest that's been my life for over a decade. The coffee was brewing while I went through my morning routine. Check the weather radio for any storm warnings. Inspect my chainsaw for any loose bolts or dull teeth. Load my gear into the back of my pickup truck. Pack enough food and water for the day, because when you're working 30 miles from the nearest convenience store, you learn to be prepared. Looking back now, I realize that habit of being prepared for anything probably saved my life. For 3 weeks leading up to that morning, something had been wrong with the forest around my cabin. I'm not talking about some mystical Native American connection to nature, though my grandfather would probably say that's exactly what it was. I'm talking about observable changes that any experienced woodsman would notice. The birds weren't singing their usual dawn chorus. The deer that normally grazed in the clearing behind my cabin had disappeared entirely. Even the insects seemed different, more agitated somehow. My neighbor Tom lived about 200 yards down the mountain from me in another cabin. He's been up here almost as long as I have, retired from the military and spends most of his time hunting and fishing. Tom's got 2 hunting dogs, German shepherds that he trained himself, and for the past 3 weeks those dogs wouldn't stop howling at night. Not barking like they'd spotted a raccoon or a deer, howling like something was terrifying them. When I asked Tom about it, he just shrugged and said they were probably picking up the scent of a bear or maybe a cougar passing through. But it wasn't just the dogs. Every animal in these mountains seemed on edge. I've been working these forests long enough to recognize when wildlife behavior changes, and everything was wrong. Squirrels were abandoning their winter preparations. Birds were flying south weeks earlier than usual. Even the spiders seemed to be building their webs in different patterns, closer to the ground, as if they were preparing for something. I keep my cabin stocked like a small fortress, not because I'm some kind of paranoid survivalist, but because living 30 miles from civilization teaches you self-reliance in ways that city people never understand. When the nearest grocery store is an hour drive down winding mountain roads, you learn to keep extra food, extra water, extra fuel, extra everything. I've got a generator in my shed, a wood-burning stove for heat, and enough canned goods to last months if I had to. That level of preparation seemed excessive to most people, but it's just common sense when you live this far off the grid. The morning of October 15th, I was loading my gear when my radio crackled to life with something I'd never heard before. Instead of the usual morning talk show discussing traffic and weather, an emergency broadcast cut through the static. The automated voice was calm but urgent, the kind of tone they use for severe weather warnings or natural disasters. This is not a test. This is an emergency broadcast from the Seattle King County Health Department. Multiple incidents of extreme violence are being reported in the downtown Seattle corridor. Citizens are advised to shelter in place immediately and avoid the following areas: Pioneer Square, Pike Place Market, Capitol Hill, and all areas south of Denny Way. Do not approach individuals displaying signs of aggressive behavior. Seek immediate medical attention for any bite wounds. This message will repeat. I stood there in my driveway, thermos of coffee in one hand and truck keys in the other, trying to process what I just heard. Extreme violence in downtown Seattle wasn't exactly shocking news. Big cities have crime, and Seattle had been dealing with its share of problems for years. But there was something about the way the announcement was worded that didn't sit right with me. They weren't talking about gang violence or domestic disputes. The phrase aggressive behavior and the specific warning about bite wounds suggested something else entirely. My phone rang while I was still standing there. Jake Torino, my foreman at Cascade Timber, was calling earlier than usual. Jake's been in the logging business for 25 years, and in all the time I've known him, I've never heard his voice shake. Not when that Widowmaker branch nearly took his head off last spring. Not when our crew got caught in that flash flood 2 summers ago. Not even when the company almost went under during the recession. But that morning, Jake's voice was shaking. "Woody, you seeing this news?" he asked. "That's what everyone calls me, Woody, because of my last name and my profession. They're saying people are attacking each other downtown. Like actually biting and eating people. My wife's got the news on, and they're showing footage that looks like something out of a horror movie." I tried to laugh it off, because what else do you do when someone tells you something that sounds impossible? "Come on, Jake. Probably just some bath salts situation. Remember that story from Florida a few years back? You want me to pick you up at the usual spot, or are we canceling today's cut?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear his television in the background. The voices of news anchors sounded urgent, almost panicked. "I don't know, Woody. This looks different. They're saying it's spreading fast and the hospitals are getting overwhelmed. Maybe we should postpone the cut until things settle down." That should have been my first real warning. Jake Torino doesn't postpone work for anything short of a major storm or equipment failure. He's the kind of guy who'd have us cutting trees in a light snowfall if the contract deadlines demanded it. For him to suggest postponing work because of news reports from Seattle meant he was genuinely worried. But I was stubborn and I had bills to pay. "Look, Jake, we're 30 miles from Seattle and another 10 miles into the forest from there. Whatever's happening downtown isn't going to affect us out here. I'll meet you at the Chevron station at 6:30 like always, and we can listen to more news on the drive to the work site." Jake agreed, but I could tell he wasn't comfortable with the decision. We hung up and I finished loading my truck. The emergency broadcast was still repeating on the radio, the same message over and over. By the time I'd locked up my cabin and started driving toward town, I'd heard it at least 6 times. Each repetition made it sound more serious, more urgent. The drive from my cabin to the Chevron station, where I usually meet Jake, takes about 20 minutes on a good day. It's a winding mountain road that eventually connects to Highway 92, which leads into Granite Falls and then on toward Seattle. On any normal Tuesday morning, that road would be busy with commuters heading into the city for work. Logging trucks, delivery vehicles, people driving to jobs in the bigger towns. The traffic isn't heavy, but it's steady. That morning the road was empty. Not just light traffic, completely empty. In 20 minutes of driving, I didn't see a single other vehicle. At first, I thought maybe I was running earlier than usual, but when I checked my watch, I was actually running a few minutes late. The absence of traffic was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was like the mountains had swallowed up all the people who should have been driving to work. I reached the Chevron station at 6:35, expecting to find Jake's truck waiting in the parking lot like it had been every workday for the past 3 years. The station was open, but Jake wasn't there. I waited 15 minutes trying to call his cell phone, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like Jake at all. He was the most punctual person I knew, and he always answered his phone. The clerk inside the gas station was a young guy named Marcus, who I'd seen there dozens of times. He was maybe 22 years old, usually friendly and talkative, always asking about the logging work and what it was like working in the deep forest. That morning, Marcus looked scared. He was constantly checking his phone and kept glancing at the small television mounted behind the counter. "Hey, Marcus," I said as I paid for gas. "You seen Jake Torino this morning? Big guy, drives the red Ford pickup." Marcus shook his head without looking away from the television. "Haven't seen anybody this morning, Mr. Blackwood. Road's been empty since I got here at 5. You hearing about this stuff happening in Seattle?" I looked at the television screen. The local news was showing aerial footage of downtown Seattle, and what I saw didn't make sense. There were people in the streets, but they weren't walking normally. They were moving in strange, jerky motions, and there seemed to be some kind of disturbance happening in multiple locations simultaneously. The news reporter was talking fast, stumbling over words, clearly struggling to describe what she was seeing. "The situation in downtown Seattle continues to deteriorate," the reporter was saying. "We're receiving reports of similar incidents in Tacoma, Everett, and several smaller communities throughout King County. Authorities are urging residents to remain indoors and avoid contact with anyone displaying signs of what health officials are calling extreme behavioral changes." Marcus turned up the volume, and we both watched as the camera zoomed in on a group of people attacking what appeared to be a police car. The people weren't using weapons or throwing objects. They were using their hands and teeth, literally trying to tear the vehicle apart to get to whoever was inside. The footage was shaky and distant, but even from the aerial view, you could see that something was fundamentally wrong with the way these people were moving. "This is crazy," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My girlfriend lives in Everett. I've been trying to call her all morning, but the phone line seemed jammed. I tried calling Jake again, but got the same result: voicemail. I tried calling my aunt in Portland, my cousin in Spokane, even the main office at Cascade Timber. Every call either went to voicemail or couldn't connect at all. The telecommunications infrastructure was either overwhelmed or breaking down entirely." Standing in that gas station, watching the news coverage and unable to reach anyone by phone, I started to understand that whatever was happening wasn't just an isolated incident in Seattle. This was bigger, and it was spreading. The empty roads, the communication breakdown, the disturbing footage on television, it all pointed to some kind of widespread emergency that was affecting the entire region. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing to the work site to wait for Jake, instead of driving toward town to see if I could help with whatever was happening, I decided to go back to my cabin. Something my grandfather had taught me years ago came back to me in that moment. He used to say that when the forest goes quiet, when the animals start acting strange, when your instincts tell you something is wrong, you don't ignore those warnings. You listen to them and you prepare for whatever is coming. The drive back to my cabin felt different than the drive down the mountain. The silence seemed heavier, more ominous. I kept the radio on, cycling through different stations, trying to get more information about what was happening. Most stations were playing automated programming or dead air. The few that were still broadcasting live were clearly struggling to understand and report on a rapidly evolving situation. One reporter on a Seattle station was trying to interview a doctor from Harborview Medical Center, but the call kept cutting in and out. What I could hear was terrifying. "Never seen anything like this," the doctor was saying. "The bite wounds are unlike anything in medical literature. The patients are displaying extreme aggression, complete loss of higher brain function, and an apparent inability to feel pain. We're seeing symptoms that resemble advanced rabies, but the progression is impossibly fast." The signal cut out completely after that, leaving me with nothing but static as I turned onto the dirt road that led to my cabin. When I reached my property, I parked the truck close to the house and immediately started checking my supplies. If this was some kind of major emergency, if the infrastructure was breaking down, I wanted to make sure I had everything I needed to wait it out. My cabin is small but well built, constructed from Douglas fir logs that I'd cut and milled myself over several years. It's got a solid foundation, thick walls, and small windows that I'd installed more for energy efficiency than security, but which now seemed like wise defensive choices. The cabin sits in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, with good sight lines in most directions but plenty of cover if I needed to move through the trees unseen. I spent the next hour taking inventory of my resources. The pantry was stocked with canned goods, dried beans, rice, and other non-perishable foods. I had a 50-gallon water tank that I kept filled, plus several cases of bottled water. The generator had enough fuel to run for weeks if I used it sparingly. My wood-burning stove could keep the cabin warm indefinitely as long as I had fuel, and being surrounded by forest, fuel wasn't going to be a problem. More importantly, I had tools that could serve as weapons if necessary. My chainsaw was in perfect working order, freshly sharpened and fueled. I had several axes of different sizes, splitting mauls, wedges, and other logging equipment that could be deadly in the right hands. I also had a hunting rifle and a shotgun, both legal and properly registered, along with several boxes of ammunition. While I was checking my supplies, I kept trying to reach people by phone and monitoring the radio for updates. The news was getting worse by the hour. Reports were coming in from cities all across the Pacific Northwest. Portland, Eugene, Bellingham, even smaller towns were experiencing what authorities were now calling mass casualty events. The common thread in all the reports was the same: people attacking other people with extreme violence, biting and tearing at victims, showing no response to pain or attempts to subdue them. By 10 o'clock that morning, I was starting to understand that this wasn't a normal emergency. This wasn't a natural disaster or a terrorist attack or even a riot. This was something else entirely, something that was spreading from person to person and turning ordinary people into violent, mindless attackers. The word zombie wasn't being used on the news yet, but that's what everyone was thinking. That's certainly what I was thinking. From my cabin, I could see smoke rising from the direction of Seattle. Not the usual haze of urban pollution, but thick, black columns that suggested major fires burning out of control. The smoke was getting thicker as the morning progressed, and I could see similar smoke columns from other directions as well. It looked like multiple cities were burning simultaneously. Around 11 o'clock, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Gunfire. Not the occasional rifle shot of someone hunting or target practicing, but sustained automatic weapons fire coming from the direction of Granite Falls. It went on for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the gunfire had been. I climbed up onto my roof to get a better view of the valley below. From that vantage point, I could see the main road that connected our area to Seattle, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. The traffic wasn't flowing toward the city anymore. Every vehicle I could see was heading away from Seattle, fleeing toward the mountains. But even more disturbing, many of the vehicles appeared to be abandoned. Cars and trucks sitting empty on the roadside, doors open, no sign of their occupants. That's when I heard my neighbor Tom's dogs howling again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the prolonged, mournful howling they'd been doing for weeks. This was sharp, panicked barking, the kind of sound dogs make when they're terrified and fighting for their lives. The barking went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped completely. The silence that followed was absolute. I climbed down from the roof and grabbed my binoculars, focusing them on Tom's cabin down the mountain. I could see his pickup truck parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of Tom himself or his dogs. The cabin looked undisturbed from the outside, but something about the scene felt wrong. After 12 years of living up here, you get to know your neighbors' routines. Tom should have been outside by now, working in his garden or chopping wood for his fireplace. The fact that I couldn't see any sign of normal activity was concerning. I considered walking down to check on him, but something held me back. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was instinct, but I decided to observe from a distance first. I set up a position where I could watch Tom's cabin through my binoculars while remaining hidden in the tree line. What I saw over the next hour convinced me that my caution was justified. Around noon, I saw movement near Tom's cabin. At first, I thought it was Tom himself, and I felt relieved. But as I watched through the binoculars, I realized that something was wrong with the way he was moving. He was stumbling, walking in an unsteady, jerky manner that wasn't at all like the confident stride I was used to seeing from him. Even more disturbing, his clothes appeared to be torn and stained with what looked like blood. As I watched, Tom walked directly into a tree, bounced off it, and kept walking as if nothing had happened. He showed no reaction to the impact, no attempt to go around the obstacle, just walked straight into it and then continued in the same direction. That's not normal human behavior. That's not the behavior of someone who's injured or sick. That's the behavior of someone whose brain is no longer functioning properly. I watched Tom wander around his property for the better part of an hour, moving in random directions, occasionally stopping to stand motionless for several minutes before resuming his aimless wandering. He never looked up at my cabin, never showed any awareness of his surroundings beyond the most basic level. It was like watching someone sleepwalk, except he was awake and his eyes were open. The radio news was becoming increasingly dire. Most stations had gone off the air entirely, leaving only emergency broadcasts and a few stations that were clearly operating with skeleton crews. The reports I could still receive painted a picture of complete societal collapse happening in real time. Cities were being evacuated, but the evacuation routes were becoming clogged with abandoned vehicles and what the broadcasters were euphemistically calling hostile individuals. One broadcast that particularly stuck with me was from a ham radio operator somewhere in eastern Washington. He was transmitting from what he said was a rural location, and he'd been monitoring emergency frequencies all morning. According to him, military units were being deployed to major population centers, but they were reporting that conventional crowd control methods weren't working. The hostile individuals weren't responding to tear gas, rubber bullets, or even live ammunition the way normal people would. They just kept attacking until they were physically incapacitated. That's when I started to accept what I'd been trying not to think about all morning. This wasn't just some kind of riot or mass hysteria. This was something that was fundamentally changing people, turning them into something that wasn't quite human anymore. The symptoms matched what you'd expect from a zombie outbreak in a movie, except this was really happening, and it was happening right outside my front door. By early afternoon, I'd made the decision to stay put in my cabin and wait for the situation to resolve itself one way or another. I had everything I needed to survive for weeks or even months if necessary. My location was isolated enough that I could avoid contact with infected individuals, but close enough to civilization that I could monitor what was happening and potentially help other survivors if the opportunity arose. I spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing my cabin's defenses and preparing for a potentially long siege. I moved supplies away from the windows, set up observation posts where I could watch the approaches to my property, and prepared my weapons for immediate use. Most importantly, I started keeping detailed notes about everything I observed, because I had a feeling that information about how these infected people behaved was going to be crucial for survival. As the sun started to set on October 15th, I realized that the world I'd woken up to that morning was gone forever. In less than 12 hours, everything had changed. The infrastructure I depended on was collapsing. The people I knew were either dead, missing, or transformed into something monstrous. And I was alone on a mountain with nothing but my skills, my supplies, and my determination to survive whatever was coming next. The forest around my cabin had gone completely silent. Not even the wind seemed to be moving through the trees. It was the kind of silence that comes before something terrible happens, the kind of silence my grandfather had warned me about years ago. I checked my weapons one more time, made sure my radio was working, and settled in to wait for whatever the night would bring. Looking back now, I realized that everything I thought I understood about survival was about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. The infected individual I'd been watching at Tom's cabin was just the beginning. What was heading toward my mountain was something far worse than one confused, stumbling man. It was an entire town full of people who were no longer people, and they were hungry. If you watched my last account, you know I'd made it back to my cabin by 10 o'clock on the morning of October 15th, thinking I understood what was happening. The emergency broadcasts were talking about violence in Seattle. I'd seen my neighbor Tom acting strangely, and the infrastructure was clearly breaking down. What I didn't know was that I had a front row seat to watch civilization collapse in real time, and that the infected individual I'd observed at Tom's cabin was just the beginning of something far worse. The radio intelligence I was gathering painted an increasingly horrifying picture. The fragmented reports coming through the static weren't using the word zombie yet, but they were describing exactly what anyone who'd ever watched a horror movie would recognize. The authorities kept talking about aggressive behavioral changes and affected individuals who should be avoided at all costs. But what they meant was that ordinary people were turning into mindless, flesh-hungry monsters who couldn't be reasoned with or stopped by conventional means. What made the situation even more terrifying was how fast it was spreading. The initial reports had focused on downtown Seattle, but by noon, similar incidents were being reported from Tacoma, Everett, Bellingham, and dozens of smaller communities throughout Washington and Oregon. This wasn't some isolated outbreak that could be contained. This was a pandemic that was moving faster than any response could keep up with, turning entire populations into predators within hours of exposure. The pattern was becoming clear from the radio reports I could still receive. Someone would get bitten or scratched by an infected person, and within a few hours, they would transform into one of the attackers themselves. The medical professionals who were still broadcasting described symptoms that progressed with frightening speed. High fever, delirium, extreme aggression, loss of higher brain functions, and finally, the complete transformation into something that was no longer recognizably human. From my position on the mountain, I could observe the progression of the outbreak in ways that people trapped in the cities couldn't. The smoke columns I'd seen rising from Seattle that morning were now visible from multiple directions. Tacoma was burning, Everett was burning, and smaller towns throughout the region were sending up their own pillars of black smoke. It looked like someone had set the entire Pacific Northwest on fire simultaneously. But what was even more disturbing than the smoke was the absence of normal forest sounds around my cabin. For 12 years, I'd lived surrounded by the constant background noise of a healthy ecosystem. Birds singing, insects buzzing, small animals rustling through the underbrush, the distant sound of larger mammals moving through the forest. That morning, all of those sounds had disappeared completely. Remember those agitated animals I mentioned yesterday? The birds flying south weeks early, Tom's dogs howling every night, the deer abandoning their usual grazing areas. They weren't agitated. They were fleeing. Every instinct they had was screaming that something terrible was coming, and unlike humans, they had the sense to listen to those warnings and get out while they still could. The silence around my cabin wasn't just unusual, it was unnatural. In all my years working in these forests, I'd never experienced anything like it. Even during the worst storms, when most animals seek shelter, you can still hear signs of life if you know how to listen. This was different. This was the silence of a forest that had been completely abandoned by every living creature, except the infected. I spent most of that afternoon using my binoculars to observe Tom's property and the surrounding area. What I saw convinced me that my decision to stay isolated in my cabin was the right choice, but it also filled me with a growing sense of dread about what was coming. Tom continued his aimless wandering around his property, moving in random directions, occasionally standing motionless for long periods, showing no awareness of his surroundings or any signs of normal human behavior. But Tom wasn't alone anymore. Throughout the afternoon, I spotted other figures moving through the forest below my position. At first, they were just glimpses through the trees, distant shapes that could have been hikers or hunters. But as I watched more carefully, I realized that these figures were moving with the same jerky, unnatural gait that I'd observed in Tom. They weren't following trails or moving with any apparent purpose. They were simply wandering, like a group of sleepwalkers scattered throughout the forest. The most disturbing thing about these infected individuals was how they seemed to be drawn to each other. When two of them came within a certain distance, maybe 50 yards or so, they would change direction and move toward each other. Not quickly, not with any obvious intelligence, but with an inexorable determination that suggested some kind of primitive herd instinct. Once they met, they would move together, gradually forming larger groups as they encountered other infected. By late afternoon, I counted at least 15 infected individuals in the area around Tom's cabin. They weren't staying at his property specifically, but they seemed to be congregating in that general area, drawn by something I couldn't identify. Maybe it was Tom himself, maybe it was some scent or sound that I couldn't detect, but they were definitely gathering in larger numbers as the day progressed. The radio news, what little I could still receive, was becoming increasingly desperate. The few stations still broadcasting were clearly operating with minimal staff, and their reports suggested that the authorities had completely lost control of the situation. Military units that had been deployed to contain the outbreak were no longer responding to commands. Evacuation routes were clogged with abandoned vehicles and overrun by infected. Emergency services had essentially ceased to function in most major population centers. One report that particularly chilled me came from a National Guard unit that was supposed to be securing the approaches to Seattle. The transmission was broken and hard to understand, but the soldier making the report was clearly terrified. He described encountering groups of infected that showed no response to warning shots, no fear of military vehicles, and no reaction to pain that would stop a normal person. According to him, the only way to stop them was to cause enough physical damage to make them unable to move. And even then, they would continue trying to attack until their bodies were completely destroyed. That's when I started to understand something that would become crucial for my survival over the next 24 hours. These infected people weren't just sick or crazy. They were operating on a completely different level of consciousness, one that didn't include fear, self-preservation, or any of the normal human responses that make people predictable. They had become pure predators, driven by nothing but the need to hunt and feed on other living beings. As the sun started to set, I made the decision to check on Tom more closely. I know that sounds like a terrible idea given what I'd been observing all day, but Tom had been my neighbor for almost as long as I'd lived on the mountain. We'd helped each other with various projects over the years, shared tools and equipment, and generally looked out for each other the way neighbors do in isolated areas like ours. I couldn't just abandon him without at least trying to determine if there was anything human left in him that could be saved. I grabbed my chainsaw, not because I planned to use it as a weapon, but because Tom had borrowed my splitting maul the week before, and I figured I might need it for firewood if this crisis dragged on for weeks. Looking back now, I wish I'd brought something else, something more appropriate for what I was about to encounter. But at the time, I was still thinking like someone who lived in a civilized world where neighbors helped neighbors and problems could be solved through reasonable conversation. The walk from my cabin to Tom's property normally takes about 10 minutes through the forest. I'd made that trip dozens of times over the years, usually to borrow tools or help with some project that required an extra pair of hands. I knew every tree, every rock, every root that might trip an unwary walker. That familiar terrain should have been comforting, but as I made my way through the unusually silent forest, every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. The first thing I noticed as I approached Tom's cabin was the smell. It wasn't the normal forest scents of pine needles and decomposing leaves. It was something organic and unpleasant, like meat that had been left out in the sun too long. The smell got stronger as I got closer to Tom's property, and by the time I reached the edge of his clearing, it was almost overwhelming. Tom's cabin looked normal from the outside. His truck was parked in the usual spot, his woodpile was neatly stacked beside the porch, and there were no obvious signs of violence or disturbance. But the smell was definitely coming from somewhere on his property, and I couldn't see Tom anywhere in the clearing. I called out his name, softly at first, then louder when I didn't get a response. That's when I saw him. Tom came around the corner of his cabin, moving with that same unsteady, jerky gait I'd been observing through my binoculars. But seeing him up close was infinitely worse than watching from a distance. His clothes were torn and stained with dried blood. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes unfocused and staring. Most disturbing of all, there was fresh blood around his mouth and on his hands, blood that definitely wasn't his own. I called out to him again, hoping for some sign of recognition, some indication that the Tom I'd known for years was still somewhere inside that shambling figure. He turned toward me when I spoke, but there was no awareness in his eyes, no acknowledgement that he knew who I was. Instead, he started moving in my direction with that same mechanical determination I'd observed earlier, his arms reaching out as if he intended to grab me. The realization that Tom was no longer human, that he'd become one of the infected creatures I'd been hearing about on the radio, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't some stranger from the city who'd been driven mad by whatever was causing the outbreak. This was someone I'd known personally, someone I'd shared meals with, someone whose dogs I'd helped train. The transformation from neighbor to monster was so complete that there was nothing left of the person he'd been. I backed away from Tom, trying to maintain distance while figuring out what to do next. He followed me with that relentless, shambling gait, never speeding up or slowing down, just maintaining a steady pace that suggested he would follow me indefinitely if I let him. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and he was making low groaning sounds that barely qualified as human vocalizations. That's when I noticed that Tom wasn't alone. The other infected individuals I'd been observing from my cabin were emerging from the forest around his property, drawn by the sound of my voice or perhaps by Tom's movement. Within minutes, I found myself facing not just one infected neighbor, but a group of at least 8 people who had all undergone the same horrifying transformation. The group moved with a coordination that was both primitive and terrifying. They didn't communicate with each other in any way I could observe, but they seemed to share a common purpose. They were surrounding me, cutting off potential escape routes, herding me like wolves surrounding prey. The intelligence required for that kind of coordinated hunting behavior suggested that whatever had infected them hadn't completely destroyed their brains, just reprogrammed them for a single, terrible purpose. I realized that I had seconds to act before they closed the circle completely. The chainsaw in my hands suddenly felt like the only thing standing between me and becoming another member of their horrifying group. I'd never used a chainsaw as a weapon before, had never even considered the possibility, but the situation left me no choice. It was either fight my way out or become infected myself. The sound of the chainsaw starting seemed to confuse the infected for a moment. They paused in their advance, perhaps startled by the sudden noise in the otherwise silent forest. That pause gave me the opening I needed to break through their loose circle and start running back toward my cabin. But even as I ran, I could hear them following me, their shuffling footsteps and low, groaning calls echoing through the trees. The chase through the forest was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The infected couldn't run, but they moved with such relentless determination that they never seemed to fall far behind. Every time I thought I'd gained enough distance to stop and catch my breath, I would hear them crashing through the underbrush, following my trail with an accuracy that suggested they were tracking me by scent or some other sense that normal humans don't possess. I reached my cabin just as full darkness was settling over the mountains. The infected were still following me, but the dense forest and the darkness seemed to slow them down enough that I could get inside and barricade the door. From my windows, I could see their shapes moving around the clearing, testing the perimeter of my property like predators looking for weaknesses in their prey's defenses. That night was one of the longest of my life. The infected remained around my cabin until well after midnight, occasionally testing the doors and windows, but never attempting a coordinated assault. They seemed content to wait, as if they knew that I would eventually have to come out, and when I did, they would be ready for me. The radio news, what little I could still receive, confirmed that similar scenes were playing out across the entire region. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, turning entire communities into hunting grounds for the monsters that had once been their neighbors and friends. Emergency broadcasts were advising people to barricade themselves in secure locations and wait for military assistance, but it was becoming clear that no help was coming. As I sat in my darkened cabin, listening to the infected moving around outside, and trying to process what I'd witnessed at Tom's property, I started to understand the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just an outbreak that would be contained and resolved within a few days. This was the end of the world as I'd known it, and the beginning of something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The forest that had been my home and workplace for 12 years had become a hunting ground populated by creatures that looked like people, but behaved like predators. The skills I'd developed as a lumberjack, the isolation I'd chosen as a lifestyle, and the preparations I'd made for emergencies were about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. By dawn on October 16th, the infected had disappeared from around my cabin, but I knew they were still out there somewhere, probably gathering in larger numbers as more people became infected and joined their ranks. The smoke columns on the horizon had multiplied overnight, suggesting that the outbreak had spread to even more communities while I'd been hiding in my cabin. I spent that morning taking inventory of my situation and planning my next moves. I had enough supplies to last for weeks, maybe months if I was careful. My weapons were functional, and I had plenty of ammunition. Most importantly, I had knowledge of the surrounding terrain that could give me significant advantages over both infected and any other survivors who might pose a threat. But I also knew that staying isolated in my cabin wasn't a long-term solution. The infected had found me once and they would find me again. Eventually, I would need to venture out for supplies, or to help other survivors, or simply to find a more secure location. When that time came, I would need to be ready for anything the transformed world could throw at me. The sound of gunfire from the direction of Granite Falls had resumed that morning, but it was more sporadic now, suggesting that whoever was doing the shooting was running low on ammunition or being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Soon, even that sound stopped entirely, leaving nothing but the unnatural silence of a forest abandoned by every living creature, except the monsters that had once been human. I climbed back up onto my roof to survey the surrounding area with my binoculars, What I saw confirmed my worst fears about the scope of the outbreak. The main road leading away from Seattle was now completely clogged with abandoned vehicles. Some had been there since the previous day, but others appeared to have been abandoned more recently. Their occupants either fled into the forest or transformed into infected themselves. More disturbing was the movement I could observe in the town of Granite Falls below. Even from several miles away, I could see figures moving through the streets in that same jerky, unnatural way that characterized the infected. The town that had been home to maybe 3,000 people was now populated entirely by monsters. And based on the radio reports I'd been hearing, the same transformation had occurred in communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. The realization that I might be one of the last uninfected people in the region was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant I was completely alone in a world that had become infinitely more dangerous overnight. Liberating because it meant I no longer had to worry about following laws or social conventions that had been designed for a civilization that no longer existed. As I prepared for whatever challenges the next 24 hours would bring, I reflected on everything my Cherokee grandfather had taught me about survival in hostile environments. He'd lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and decades of discrimination and hardship, and his lessons about adaptability, patience, and respect for the natural world were about to become more valuable than any formal education I'd ever received. The forest around my cabin was no longer the peaceful workplace it had been for 12 years. It had become a battleground where the rules of civilization no longer applied, where the only law was survival of the fittest, and where the difference between life and death could be measured in seconds of reaction time and the accuracy of a chainsaw swing. But I was still alive, still uninfected, and still capable of thinking and planning in ways that the monsters roaming the forest could not. That gave me advantages that I intended to use to their fullest extent. The world had ended, but I was determined to survive whatever came next, and maybe even help other survivors do the same if the opportunity presented itself. The question wasn't whether I could survive in this new world. The question was how many others I could save before the infection claimed them too, and whether anything resembling human civilization could ever be rebuilt from the ashes of what we'd lost. But those were problems for another day. First, I had to make it through the next 24 hours, and based on what I could see happening in the valley below, that was going to be more challenging than anything I'd faced so far. By noon on October 16th, I knew my neighbor Tom was infected with something that made him want to eat me alive. What I didn't know was that he was one of thousands, and that the small logging town of Granite Falls, which had been my connection to civilization for 12 years, was about to become ground zero for something that would make the previous day's horrors look like a minor disturbance. From my elevated position on the mountain, I had the kind of vantage point that military strategists would kill for. My cabin sits on a ridge that overlooks the entire valley, giving me clear sight lines to Granite Falls 3 miles below, the main highway that connects our area to Seattle, and the network of logging roads that crisscross the surrounding mountains. That geographic advantage was about to become the difference between life and death, not just for me, but for people I didn't even know yet. The view through my binoculars that afternoon revealed a pattern of destruction that was spreading like a cancer across the landscape. The main road that normally carried commuters and commercial traffic between Granite Falls and Seattle had become a graveyard of abandoned vehicles. But the abandonment wasn't random. The cars and trucks weren't just scattered along the roadside like you'd see after a normal evacuation. They were clustered in specific areas, with clear signs that their occupants had fled in panic or been dragged from their vehicles by force. More disturbing than the abandoned vehicles was the movement I could observe throughout the valley. From my mountain perch, the infected looked like ants swarming over a disturbed nest, moving in seemingly random patterns, but with an underlying coordination that suggested some kind of primitive collective intelligence. They weren't just wandering aimlessly like Tom had been doing around his cabin. They were moving with purpose, following scent trails or responding to stimuli that I couldn't detect from my distance. The pattern of infection was becoming clear as I watched the chaos unfold below. Groups of infected would converge on isolated buildings or vehicles where survivors were hiding, overwhelming them through sheer numbers rather than any kind of tactical intelligence. Once they'd broken through whatever defenses the survivors had managed to construct, the screaming would start, then stop abruptly after a few minutes. Within an hour or two, the former survivors would emerge from their hiding places as new members of the infected horde. What made the situation even more terrifying was the speed at which the infection was spreading. I could literally watch the transformation happen in real time through my binoculars. A group of survivors would barricade themselves in a building, thinking they were safe. The infected would gather outside, testing doors and windows with the patience of predators who knew their prey couldn't escape. Eventually, they would find a weakness, break through the defenses, and within hours, the building would disgorge a larger group of infected than had originally attacked it. From my ridge, I could see the main road that connected our area to Seattle, and the traffic patterns told a story of civilization's complete collapse. During the morning, there had still been some vehicles trying to flee toward the mountains, carrying refugees from the infected cities below. By early afternoon, even that trickle of traffic had stopped entirely. The road was now populated only by the infected, who seemed to be following the abandoned vehicles back toward their sources, spreading the contagion to every community that had tried to help the fleeing survivors. The radio broadcasts I could still receive painted an even grimmer picture of the regional situation. The few stations still operating were clearly running on emergency power and skeleton crews, broadcasting desperate pleas for military assistance that everyone knew wasn't coming. The National Guard units that had been deployed to contain the outbreak had either been overrun or had simply stopped responding to radio calls. Emergency services in major cities had ceased to function entirely, leaving millions of people to face the infection with no organized help whatsoever. One transmission that particularly stuck with me came from what sounded like a hospital somewhere in the Seattle area. The person broadcasting identified himself as a doctor, and his voice carried the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching everything you've worked for your entire life crumble in a matter of hours. He described patients who had been brought in with bite wounds, transforming into attackers within the hospital itself, turning medical facilities into slaughterhouses where the staff became victims of the people they were trying to help. According to the doctor, the infection showed characteristics that defied everything medical science understood about disease transmission. The incubation period was measured in hours rather than days or weeks. The transformation was complete and irreversible, destroying all higher brain functions while leaving the infected with enhanced strength and an absolute lack of response to pain. Most terrifying of all, the infected retained enough motor function and primitive intelligence to use simple tools and coordinate basic hunting strategies. As I listened to these reports and watched the destruction spread through the valley below, I started to understand that my isolated mountain location wasn't just a good hiding place. It was perfect for observing how the infection spread, learning the behavior patterns of the infected, and potentially developing strategies that could help other survivors avoid the fate that had befallen most of the population. The infected seemed to be drawn to areas of human activity, following roads, power lines, and other signs of civilization like a bloodhound following a scent trail. They moved more slowly than normal humans, but they never seemed to tire or need rest. They could pursue prey for hours without stopping, wearing down survivors who might be able to outrun them initially but couldn't maintain that pace indefinitely. More importantly, I observed that the infected had difficulty navigating dense forest terrain. They could follow established trails, but when confronted with thick underbrush, fallen logs, or steep terrain, they became confused and disoriented. That observation would prove crucial in the hours to come, because it suggested that someone with extensive knowledge of forest navigation could potentially evade infected groups even when outnumbered. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, I heard something that changed everything. Human voices, not the groaning calls of the infected, but actual human speech coming from the direction of Granite Falls. I adjusted my radio to scan emergency frequencies and picked up a transmission that made my blood run cold and filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. This is Mike Morrison at Morrison's Hardware in Granite Falls. If anyone can hear this, we're trapped in the store with my wife and 2 kids. The building is surrounded by those things, and we're running out of food and water. We've been here since yesterday morning, and they just keep gathering outside. If there's anyone out there who can help, we're on the main street, red brick building with Morrison's Hardware painted on the front. Please, if you can hear this, we have children. I knew Mike Morrison. Not well, but well enough to have bought supplies from his hardware store dozens of times over the years. He was a good man, maybe 40 years old, with a wife named Sarah and 2 kids, Tommy and Lisa. Tommy was about 8 years old, Lisa maybe 6. The thought of those children trapped in that store, surrounded by infected, waiting for help that might never come, was more than I could bear. But helping them would mean leaving the safety of my cabin and venturing into the heart of the infected zone. It would mean abandoning the defensive position I'd spent 2 days preparing and risking my own life for people I barely knew. Every rational thought in my head told me to stay put, to keep monitoring the radio for safer rescue opportunities, to wait for military forces that might never arrive. Then I remembered what my Cherokee grandfather had told me about being a warrior. He'd served in World War II, fighting in the Pacific Theater, and he'd seen things that haunted him for the rest of his life. But he always said that courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was feeling the fear and acting anyway because it was the right thing to do. He said that a warrior's greatest victory wasn't defeating an enemy in battle, but protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. I spent the next hour conducting detailed reconnaissance of Granite Falls through my binoculars, mapping the locations of infected groups, identifying potential approach routes, and planning an extraction strategy that might actually work. The town that I'd visited weekly for 12 years had become an alien landscape populated by creatures that looked human, but behaved like predators. Every street corner could hide an ambush, every building could contain dozens of infected, and every wrong decision could mean death or transformation into one of the monsters I was trying to avoid. Morrison's Hardware was located on Main Street, right in the heart of the commercial district. Under normal circumstances, it would be a 5-minute walk from any parking area. But these weren't normal circumstances. The building was indeed surrounded by infected, maybe 30 or 40 of them milling around the front entrance and sides of the store. They weren't actively trying to break in, but they were maintaining a loose perimeter that suggested they knew prey was inside and were prepared to wait as long as necessary. The infected around Morrison's Hardware weren't just the shambling, disorganized creatures I'd observed earlier. These showed signs of coordination and planning that suggested the infection was evolving, adapting to the challenges of hunting human prey. They'd positioned themselves to cover all the obvious escape routes from the building, and they were taking turns testing doors and windows in a systematic way that implied they were learning from their failures. I could see Mike Morrison occasionally at one of the upper floor windows, using what looked like a mirror or piece of metal to signal that they were still alive. But I could also see that the infected were aware of his presence. Every time he appeared at the window, several of them would move to positions directly below, reaching upward with their arms as if they were trying to climb the walls. The extraction would require careful timing, specialized equipment, and a level of forest craft that most people don't possess. Fortunately, I had advantages that made the mission possible, if not exactly safe. I knew every logging road, hunting trail, and deer path within a 20-mile radius. I had tools that could serve as weapons and climbing equipment. Most importantly, I'd spent 12 years moving through dense forests as quietly as a shadow, skills that would be essential for avoiding infected patrols during the approach to town. My plan was complex but achievable. I would use the network of logging roads to get within half a mile of town, without using the main highway where infected were most concentrated. Then I would move on foot through the forest, approaching Morrison's hardware from the backside, where there appeared to be fewer infected. I would signal Mike Morrison using a predetermined pattern we could establish over the radio, coordinate a distraction that would draw the infected away from the building, and extract the family using forest trails that the infected couldn't follow effectively. The key to success would be understanding infected behavior patterns and using them against the creatures themselves. I'd observed that they were attracted to sound and movement, but they had difficulty following complex trail systems through dense forest. They could pursue prey relentlessly on open ground, but they became confused and disoriented when confronted with obstacles that required problem-solving skills they no longer possessed. I spent another hour preparing equipment for the mission. My chainsaw would be essential, not just as a weapon, but as a tool for cutting through obstacles and creating distractions. I packed rope, axes, a first aid kit, and enough food and water for 5 people for several days. Most importantly, I prepared detailed maps of the forest trails between Granite Falls and my cabin, because getting the Morrison family out of town would only be the first part of the challenge. As the sun started to set on October 16th, I made radio contact with Mike Morrison and explained my plan. His relief at hearing another human voice was almost heartbreaking, and his willingness to trust a plan that required him to risk his family's lives spoke to just how desperate their situation had become. We established communication protocols, synchronized our watches, and agreed on signals that would coordinate our actions without alerting the infected to what we were planning. The last thing I did before leaving my cabin was record a message explaining what I was attempting and why. If the mission failed, if I was killed or infected during the extraction attempt, I wanted there to be some record of what had happened to the Morrison family and what I'd learned about surviving in a world populated by the infected. That recording is part of what you're hearing now, proof that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for territory or resources, but simply to preserve the humanity that separates us from the monsters we're fighting. The journey from my cabin to the outskirts of Granite Falls normally takes about 30 minutes by truck on the main road. Moving on foot through forest trails while avoiding infected patrols took more than 2 hours, but it gave me opportunities to observe infected behavior that would prove crucial during the extraction itself. The infected were indeed following established paths and roads, but they moved in loose groups rather than as individuals, suggesting some kind of pack hunting instinct that made them more dangerous than isolated creatures. I reached my final observation position just as full darkness settled over the valley. Morrison's hardware was still surrounded, but the infected seemed less active in the darkness, moving more slowly and showing less coordination than they had during daylight hours. That gave me hope that the extraction might be possible, but it also meant that any mistakes would be magnified by the difficulty of moving and communicating in complete darkness. Mike Morrison's voice crackled through my radio, barely above a whisper but clear enough to understand. "Woody, is that really you out there? We can see some kind of light moving in the forest behind the store. Please tell me that's you and not more of those things." I confirmed my position and began the final phase of the plan. The Morrison family was about to learn whether 12 years of forest experience and 2 days of careful observation were enough to save 4 lives in a world where a single mistake could mean death or something far worse. The infected around their building were about to discover that not all prey was helpless, and that sometimes the hunter could become the hunted. But as I prepared to signal Mike Morrison to begin the extraction, I realized that saving his family was only the beginning of a much larger challenge. Getting them out of the hardware store would be difficult, But keeping them alive in a world populated by infected monsters would require skills and resources that none of us possessed yet. The real test wouldn't be the next few hours. It would be the days, weeks, and months that followed, as we learned to survive in a world where civilization had collapsed and humanity itself was an endangered species. The radio crackled again with Mike Morrison's voice, and I could hear the fear and hope warring in his tone. "Woody, whatever you're planning, we're ready. Sarah has the kids prepared to move fast, and we've got our supplies packed. Just tell us when and where, and we'll follow your lead." I took a deep breath, checked my equipment one final time, and prepared to find out whether everything I'd learned about survival in hostile environments would be enough to save a family I barely knew but couldn't abandon to the monsters that had once been their neighbors. If you've been following my account, you know I'd made it to the edge of Granite Falls by sunset on October 16th. The town I'd known for 12 years, where I'd bought supplies and shared conversations with neighbors, was gone. In its place was something from a nightmare, a hunting ground where creatures that looked like people prowled the streets searching for prey that was becoming harder and harder to find. The transformation of familiar streets into a death zone was more disturbing than anything I'd witnessed so far. Main Street, where I'd walked countless times to pick up hardware supplies or grab coffee at the diner, was now littered with abandoned cars, broken glass, and dark stains on the pavement that I didn't want to think about too carefully. The streetlights were still functioning, casting pools of yellow light that revealed infected figures moving through the shadows with that jerky, unnatural gait that had become their signature. What struck me most about the infected behavior patterns was how they'd adapted to urban hunting in just 2 days. They weren't just wandering randomly like my neighbor Tom had been doing around his cabin. These creatures had learned to use the infrastructure of the town itself as a hunting tool. They positioned themselves in doorways and alleys where they could ambush anyone trying to move between buildings. They gathered around vehicles that might contain survivors, testing doors and windows with a patience that was both methodical and terrifying. I noticed something crucial as I observed their movements through my binoculars. The infected were drawn to sound and movement, just as I'd suspected, but they seemed almost blind in the growing darkness. They relied heavily on their other senses, probably smell and hearing, to track prey after sunset. My years of moving quietly through forests, avoiding game animals that had far better senses than humans, suddenly became a superpower in this new world where stealth could mean the difference between life and death. The approach to Morrison's hardware required me to move through territory that was completely controlled by the infected. Every street corner could hide an ambush. Every parked car could conceal a creature waiting to grab anyone who passed too close, and every building could contain dozens of infected drawn by the scent of potential prey. The familiar geography of Granite Falls had become a three-dimensional puzzle, where one wrong step could trigger a chain reaction that would bring every infected creature in town down on my position. I used the network of back alleys and service roads that most people never noticed, the hidden infrastructure that keeps small towns functioning. Loading docks behind stores, maintenance paths between buildings, drainage ditches that ran parallel to the main streets. My knowledge of these forgotten spaces came from 12 years of making deliveries and pickups for Cascade Timber, learning the efficient routes that saved time and avoided traffic. Now that same knowledge was keeping me alive and undetected in a town full of predators. The infected had difficulty with complex navigation, I'd noticed. They could follow roads and obvious paths, but when confronted with obstacles that required problem-solving skills, they became confused and disoriented. A fallen tree across a trail would stop them completely. A chain-link fence that required climbing was an insurmountable barrier. Even stairs seemed to present challenges that their damaged brains couldn't process effectively. Morrison's hardware sat on Main Street like a fortress under siege. The red brick building that had been a cornerstone of the community for 3 generations was now surrounded by infected creatures who seemed to understand that prey was inside but couldn't figure out how to reach it. The front entrance was blocked by at least 20 infected, milling around the doors and windows like wolves circling a wounded deer. From my hiding position in the alley behind the barber shop, I could see Mike Morrison occasionally at the second-floor window above the store. He was using a small mirror to catch light from the street lamps, creating brief flashes that confirmed he was still alive and alert. But I could also see that the infected were aware of his presence. Every time he appeared at the window, several of them would move to positions directly below the building, reaching upward with their arms in a futile attempt to climb the brick walls. The sight of those creatures reaching toward the window where Mike Morrison was hiding filled me with a rage that surprised me. These had been his neighbors, his customers, people who had shopped in his store and trusted him to provide the tools and supplies they needed for their daily lives. Now they were trying to kill him and his family, driven by an infection that had stripped away everything human about them except their physical appearance. I established radio contact with Mike using a frequency we'd agreed on earlier. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the relief in his tone was unmistakable. "Woody, thank God you're here. We can see your position from the window. Sarah has the kids ready to move, and we've got our supplies packed in backpacks like you suggested. Just tell us what to do." The extraction plan I developed was complex but necessary. The infected around Morrison's hardware weren't going to simply wander away, and a direct assault would only attract more creatures from other parts of town. Instead, I needed to create a distraction that would draw them away from the building long enough for the Morrison family to escape through a route the infected couldn't follow. My chainsaw would be the key to the distraction. The infected were attracted to loud noises, and the sound of a chainsaw starting up would be irresistible to every creature within several blocks. But I couldn't just start it up randomly and hope for the best. The distraction had to be precisely timed and positioned to draw the infected away from Morrison's hardware, while giving me enough time to reach the family and guide them to safety. I positioned myself 3 blocks away from the hardware store, in the parking lot behind the old lumber mill, where I delivered countless loads of timber over the years. The mill had been shut down for months, making it the perfect location for a distraction that wouldn't endanger any other survivors. More importantly, the mill's location would draw the infected away from Morrison's hardware and toward an area where I could control the encounter on my own terms. The sound of my chainsaw starting up in the darkness was like a dinner bell for every infected creature in Granite Falls. Within minutes, I could see them streaming toward my position from all directions, drawn by the promise of prey that the noise suggested. The infected that had been surrounding Morrison's hardware abandoned their posts and joined the general migration toward the lumber mill, leaving the store temporarily undefended. That was Mike Morrison's cue to move. I watched through my binoculars as the family emerged from the back door of the hardware store, moving quickly but quietly toward the forest edge where I'd told them to wait for me. Mike was carrying 8-year-old Tommy on his back, while Sarah held 6-year-old Lisa's hand and guided her through the darkness. They moved with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that this might be their only chance at survival. But my distraction was working too well. The infected were converging on the lumber mill faster than I'd anticipated, and there were more of them than I'd counted during my earlier reconnaissance. What had started as a controlled diversion was rapidly becoming a situation where I might be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. I had maybe 2 minutes before the first infected reached my position, and at least 50 creatures were heading my way. The chainsaw that had been my tool for creating the distraction now became my primary weapon. I'd never used a chainsaw to fight anything more dangerous than a stubborn tree root, but the situation left me no choice. The infected that reached me first moved with that same relentless determination I'd observed in my neighbor Tom, showing no fear of the running chainsaw and no instinct for self-preservation that might make them hesitate or retreat. Fighting infected creatures with a chainsaw was unlike anything I'd ever experienced or could have imagined. They felt no pain, showed no fear, and kept attacking even when severely injured. The only way to stop them was to cause enough physical damage to make them unable to move. And even then, they would continue trying to grab and bite until their bodies were completely destroyed. The noise of the chainsaw and the combat drew even more infected from other parts of town. What had started as a rescue mission was becoming a running battle through the streets of Granite Falls, with me serving as bait to keep the creatures away from the Morrison family, while they made their way to the relative safety of the forest. Every swing of the chainsaw, every successful strike against an infected attacker, bought the family a few more seconds to increase their distance from the immediate danger. The psychological impact of using lethal force against creatures that looked like people was something I hadn't prepared for. Intellectually, I knew these weren't human beings anymore. They were infected monsters driven by nothing but the need to kill and feed. But emotionally, they still looked like neighbors, like people I might have known or served in the hardware store. Some of them were wearing familiar clothes, carrying personal items that spoke to the lives they'd lived before the infection transformed them into predators. I fought my way through the streets of Granite Falls for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The infected kept coming, drawn by the noise and the scent of uninfected prey, but their numbers were finite. Eventually, I'd either killed or disabled most of the creatures in the immediate area, leaving me free to disengage and make my way toward the forest where the Morrison family was waiting. The retreat from town was almost as dangerous as the rescue itself. Infected creatures were still active throughout Granite Falls, and the noise of the chainsaw had alerted every monster within miles to my presence. I had to move quickly through territory I knew well, using my knowledge of back roads and forest trails to stay ahead of the pursuit, while making my way toward the rendezvous point where the Morrison family should be waiting. I found them huddled together at the edge of the forest, exactly where I'd told them to wait. The children were terrified but quiet, understanding instinctively that silence was essential for survival. Sarah Morrison was holding both kids close, her eyes wide with shock at what she'd witnessed during their escape from town. Mike Morrison was trying to stay alert for approaching threats while comforting his family, but I could see the strain of the past 2 days written on his face. "Is that really you, Woody?" Mike whispered as I approached their hiding position. "We heard all that noise from town, and we were afraid something had happened to you. Are those things still following us?" I assured him that we'd successfully broken contact with the infected, but that we needed to keep moving toward my cabin where we'd be safer. The forest trails between Granite Falls and my mountain refuge were familiar territory for me, but they would be challenging for an urban family with young children. More importantly, we were carrying supplies and equipment that would slow us down if we encountered more infected during the journey. The hike through the forest took most of the night. We moved slowly and quietly, following deer trails and logging roads that I'd used for years, but which were completely unfamiliar to the Morrison family. The children were exhausted, but they never complained or asked to rest, understanding that their lives depended on reaching safety before dawn brought new dangers. Tommy Morrison, despite being only 8 years old, showed remarkable courage during the journey. He helped his younger sister Lisa when she stumbled, carried his own small backpack without complaint, and asked intelligent questions about forest navigation and infected behavior. The kid had the instincts of a natural survivor, and I found myself thinking that if we were going to rebuild some kind of human community after this disaster, children like Tommy would be essential for the future. Sarah Morrison was struggling with the psychological impact of what she'd witnessed. Seeing her hometown transformed into a hunting ground, watching neighbors and friends turned into monsters, had shaken her faith in everything she'd believed about safety and civilization. She kept looking back toward Granite Falls, as if she couldn't quite accept that the life she'd known for 40 years was gone forever. Mike Morrison was adapting to the new reality with the practical mindset of someone who'd spent his life solving problems and helping people. He asked detailed questions about infected behavior, about survival strategies, about the resources we'd need to stay alive in a world where normal supply chains had completely broken down. His hardware store experience was already proving valuable as he identified tools and materials we could use for fortification and defense. We reached my cabin just as the sun was rising on October 17th. The familiar sight of my home, isolated and defensible in its mountain clearing, felt like the first safe harbor any of us had seen since this nightmare began. The Morrison family was exhausted, traumatized, and grieving for the world they'd lost, but they were alive and uninfected, which was more than could be said for most of the population of Granite Falls. The next few hours were spent getting the family settled, treating minor injuries from our night journey, and establishing the routines that would keep us alive in the days to come. My cabin, which had been designed and supplied for one person living alone, now had to accommodate a family of 4 while maintaining the security and resource management that would be essential for long-term survival. But even as we worked to establish our new living arrangements, I knew that reaching my cabin was only the beginning of a much larger challenge. The infected were still out there, probably following our trail or searching for other survivors to hunt. The resources we'd brought from Morrison's hardware would last for weeks, but not forever. Most importantly, we had no idea whether other survivors existed, whether any kind of organized response to the outbreak was being mounted, or whether the infection was spreading beyond the Pacific Northwest to other parts of the country. The radio news, what little we could still receive, suggested that the situation was deteriorating rapidly across the entire region. Military units had stopped responding to commands, major cities were burning out of control, and emergency services had ceased to function in most areas. We were truly on our own, a small group of survivors trying to preserve some remnant of humanity in a world that had been transformed into something alien and hostile. As I looked at the Morrison family settling into their new reality, I realized that the rescue mission had changed me as much as it had saved them. I was no longer just a lumberjack trying to survive alone on a mountain. I was now responsible for protecting a family, for preserving knowledge and skills that might be essential for rebuilding civilization, and for making decisions that would determine whether humanity had any future at all in this transformed world. The infected that I'd fought in Granite Falls had been terrifying, but they were just the beginning of the challenges we'd face. The real test would be whether we could maintain our humanity while doing whatever was necessary to survive, whether we could build something worth preserving from the ashes of the world we'd lost, and whether the children like Tommy and Lisa Morrison would have any kind of future worth living for. But those were problems for tomorrow. Today we were alive, we were together, and we had shelter, supplies, and the knowledge we'd need to face whatever came next. In a world where most people had become monsters, that was more than we had any right to hope for, and it was enough to build on if we were smart, careful, and very, very lucky. In my last account, I told you about Mike Morrison's sacrifice and how I managed to get his family out of that alley behind Morrison's hardware. What I didn't tell you was what I had to do next, and why the choices I made in those final hours still keep me awake at night. The extraction from Granite Falls had been successful, but success in this new world came with a price that I'm still learning how to pay. The situation in that alley was worse than I'd let on. We weren't just surrounded by 30 or 40 infected creatures. The sound of my chainsaw during the rescue operation had drawn every infected individual from a 6-block radius, creating a concentration of monsters that turned a narrow alley into a death trap. Sarah Morrison was holding her children against the brick wall behind the hardware store, 8-year-old Tommy trying to be brave, while 6-year-old Lisa sobbed quietly into her mother's shoulder. Mike Morrison was gone. He'd drawn the main group of infected away from us by running toward Main Street, shouting and making noise to keep their attention focused on him instead of his family. Through the chaos and darkness, I'd heard his voice getting farther away, then the sounds of a struggle, then silence. A husband and father had sacrificed himself to give his family a chance at survival, and now it was my responsibility to make sure that sacrifice meant something. The infected closing in from both ends of the alley moved with that relentless coordination I'd observed throughout the day. They weren't just random monsters stumbling through the darkness. They were hunters who had learned to work together, cutting off escape routes and herding prey into positions where they could be overwhelmed by superior numbers. The primitive intelligence that drove their behavior was becoming more sophisticated as they gained experience hunting human survivors. I had maybe 30 seconds before they closed the distance completely. The chainsaw in my hands was already running, but fighting our way through 20 infected creatures while protecting 2 children and their traumatized mother would be impossible. Even if I could clear a path, the noise would draw every infected creature in Granite Falls to our position, turning the rescue into a suicide mission that would accomplish nothing except adding 4 more victims to the outbreak's death toll. That's when I made a choice that still haunts me. Instead of trying to fight our way through the infected horde, I used my chainsaw to cut through the wooden fence behind the hardware store, creating an escape route directly into the forest where the infected couldn't follow us effectively. The sound of the chainsaw cutting through wood was loud enough to confuse the infected about our exact location, giving us the few seconds we needed to slip through the gap and disappear into the darkness. But creating that escape route required me to abandon any hope of helping Mike Morrison. I could hear infected creatures converging on his position, and I knew that every second I spent cutting through that fence was a second that might have made the difference between his survival and his death. The choice between saving a man I barely knew and protecting his family was the kind of decision that no one should ever have to make. But in this new world, impossible choices had become part of daily survival. Sarah Morrison understood what was happening without any explanation from me. As I helped her and the children through the gap in the fence, she looked back toward the sounds coming from Main Street, where her husband was making his last stand. The expression on her face was something I'll never forget, a mixture of grief, terror, and determination that captured everything about what the outbreak had done to the human experience. Tommy Morrison, despite being only 8 years old, seemed to grasp the situation with a clarity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. As we moved into the forest, he helped his younger sister Lisa navigate the rough terrain while staying close enough to his mother to provide emotional support. The kid had been forced to grow up in the space of 48 hours, learning lessons about loss and survival that most people never have to face in their entire lives. The escape through the forest was a nightmare of trying to move quickly, while remaining silent enough to avoid attracting the attention of infected creatures who might be following our trail. The dense underbrush that had protected us from the infected in the alley now became an obstacle course that slowed our progress and threatened to separate us in the darkness. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, every whispered instruction to the children carried the risk of alerting predators to our location. I led the family through terrain that I'd known for 12 years, following deer trails and logging paths that were invisible to anyone without extensive forest experience. The infected had difficulty with complex navigation, but they were persistent trackers who could follow scent trails for miles if they locked onto prey. Our only advantage was that the dense forest provided obstacles and confusion that their damaged brains couldn't process effectively. The physical challenge of carrying supplies and helping exhausted family members through difficult terrain was compounded by the psychological stress of knowing that we were being hunted by creatures who had once been human beings. Every shadow could hide a predator, every sound could signal an approaching attack, and every decision about which path to take could mean the difference between reaching safety and becoming infected ourselves. Lisa Morrison was struggling with exhaustion and trauma, but she never complained or asked to rest. Her 6-year-old mind was processing the fact that her father was gone, that her hometown had become a place of monsters, and that her entire world had been transformed into something alien and dangerous. The resilience she showed during that forest march was a testament to the strength that children can find when survival depends on it. Sarah Morrison was dealing with grief that went beyond the loss of her husband. She was watching the destruction of everything she'd built her life around, the community where she'd raised her children, the social structure that had provided meaning and security for 40 years. The infected outbreak hadn't just killed people, it had destroyed the entire framework of civilization that made human life predictable and safe. We moved through the forest for hours, following routes that took us further from Granite Falls and closer to the mountain refuge, where my cabin offered the best hope of long-term survival. The sounds of the infected gradually faded behind us, but I knew they were still out there, probably following our trail at their own relentless pace. The forest that had once been my peaceful workplace had become a battlefield where the rules of nature had been suspended and replaced by something far more dangerous. Around midnight, we reached a clearing about halfway between Granite Falls and my cabin, where I decided we should rest and assess our situation. The Morrison family was exhausted, dehydrated, and emotionally devastated, but they were alive and uninfected, which was more than could be said for most of the people who'd been in Granite Falls when the outbreak reached the town. The brief rest in the clearing gave me a chance to take inventory of our resources and plan the final approach to my cabin. We had enough food and water for several days, basic medical supplies from Morrison's Hardware, and the tools and equipment I'd brought for the rescue mission. More importantly, we had knowledge and skills that could be essential for survival, from my forest expertise to Mike Morrison's hardware and construction experience that his family could carry forward. Tommy Morrison surprised me during that rest stop by asking intelligent questions about infected behavior and survival strategies. He wanted to understand why the infected moved the way they did, how they tracked prey, and what kind of defenses might be effective against them. His 8-year-old mind was already adapting to a world where such knowledge would be essential for staying alive. The final approach to my cabin required us to cross terrain that was familiar to me but potentially dangerous for a family that had never spent time in deep forest. Steep slopes, fallen logs, stream crossings, and areas of dense underbrush that could easily separate us or slow us down enough for pursuing infected to catch up. Every step had to be carefully planned and executed to avoid accidents that could compromise our ability to reach safety. We reached my cabin just as dawn was breaking on October 17th, 48 hours after I'd first heard those emergency broadcasts about violence in downtown Seattle. The familiar sight of my home, isolated and defensible in its mountain clearing, represented the first genuine safety any of us had experienced since the outbreak began. But I also knew that reaching the cabin was only the beginning of a much larger challenge. My cabin had been designed and supplied for one person living alone, and now it had to accommodate a family of 4 while maintaining the security and resource management that would be essential for long-term survival. The stockpile of food, water, fuel, and other supplies that had seemed adequate for months of solitary living would last much less time when divided among 4 people, especially when 2 of them were growing children. The first few hours after reaching the cabin were spent getting the Morrison family settled, treating minor injuries from our night journey through the forest, and establishing routines that would keep us alive in the days to come. Sarah Morrison was struggling with exhaustion and grief, but she threw herself into practical tasks like organizing supplies and setting up sleeping areas for the children. Work seemed to help her process the trauma of losing her husband and her entire way of life. Tommy Morrison adapted to our new living situation with remarkable resilience. He helped his mother with practical tasks, entertained his younger sister when she became frightened, and asked detailed questions about forest survival and defense against infected creatures. The kid was already thinking like a survivor, understanding that knowledge and preparation would be essential for staying alive in this transformed world. Lisa Morrison was dealing with trauma that went beyond what any 6-year-old should have to experience, but she responded well to the sense of safety that my cabin provided. Having walls around her, a roof over her head, and adults who were focused on protection rather than mere survival seemed to help her begin processing what had happened to her family and her community. The radio news, what little we could still receive, confirmed that our local experience was part of a much larger catastrophe. The infection had spread to cities and towns throughout the Pacific Northwest, and similar outbreaks were being reported from other parts of the country. Military units were no longer responding to commands. Emergency services had ceased to function, and the federal government seemed to have lost all effective control over the situation. One broadcast that particularly struck me came from what sounded like a university professor somewhere in California. He was transmitting from what he called a research facility, and he'd been studying the infection since the early stages of the outbreak. According to his observations, the infected retained enough primitive intelligence to learn from experience, adapt their hunting strategies, and coordinate simple tactics that made them increasingly dangerous over time. The professor described infected behavior that matched what I'd observed in Granite Falls. The creatures were drawn to sound and movement, but they could also follow scent trails and seemed to have some kind of collective memory that allowed them to learn from encounters with human survivors. More disturbing, he suggested that the infection was continuing to evolve, potentially developing new characteristics that would make infected individuals even more effective predators. That information reinforced my understanding that the infected around Granite Falls wouldn't simply wander away or lose interest in pursuing survivors. They were patient, persistent hunters who would continue searching for prey until they either found it or were physically destroyed. My cabin's isolated location provided temporary safety, but it wasn't a permanent solution to the threat they represented. Over the next few days, we established routines that balanced security, resource management, and the emotional needs of a traumatized family. Sarah Morrison took charge of meal planning and supply rationing, using her experience managing a household to stretch our resources as far as possible. Tommy Morrison became my assistant for security observations and forest reconnaissance, learning skills that would be essential if he was going to survive to adulthood in this new world. Lisa Morrison gradually began to respond to the stability that our mountain refuge provided. She started talking about her father in past tense, accepting the reality of his death while preserving memories of the man who had sacrificed himself to save his family. Her ability to adapt to loss and change was both inspiring and heartbreaking, a reminder of the resilience that children possess when survival depends on it. The question of long-term survival became more pressing as we settled into our new routine. My stockpile of supplies was extensive, but it wasn't infinite. Eventually, we would need to venture out for food, fuel, medical supplies, and other resources that couldn't be produced or maintained at the cabin. Every such expedition would involve the risk of encountering infected creatures or other survivors who might not have peaceful intentions. More importantly, we had no way of knowing whether the infection was spreading beyond the Pacific Northwest, whether any kind of organized response was being mounted by surviving government or military units, or whether other communities of survivors existed that we might be able to contact and potentially join forces with. The radio broadcasts were becoming increasingly sporadic, suggesting that the infrastructure supporting communication was breaking down along with everything else. The psychological challenge of adapting to our new reality was as difficult as the practical challenges of survival. Sarah Morrison was grieving not just for her husband, but for the entire life she'd built around community, routine, and the assumption that civilization would continue to provide safety and predictability. Tommy and Lisa Morrison were learning to live with loss and uncertainty that would have been traumatic for adults, let alone children. But we were adapting, learning, and finding ways to preserve some elements of humanity, even in circumstances that seemed designed to strip away everything civilized about human existence. The children still played games, Sarah still told stories, and I still found satisfaction in practical work that protected and provided for people I'd come to care about. The infection had destroyed civilization, but it hadn't destroyed the human capacity for connection, growth, and hope. As I reflected on everything that had happened during those first 24 hours of the outbreak, I realized that the rescue of the Morrison family had changed me as much as it had saved them. I was no longer just a lumberjack trying to survive alone on a mountain. I was now part of a small community of survivors who were responsible for preserving knowledge, skills, and values that might be essential for rebuilding some kind of human society from the ashes of what we'd lost. The infected creatures roaming the forests around our cabin represented an ongoing threat that would require constant vigilance and careful planning to avoid or defeat. But they were just monsters, driven by primitive instincts and limited by damaged brains that couldn't adapt or learn as quickly as the human survivors they were hunting. The real challenge would be maintaining our humanity while doing whatever was necessary to survive, preserving hope and compassion in a world that seemed designed to destroy both. The forest that had been my home and workplace for 12 years had become something entirely different. A hostile environment where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But it was still a place where knowledge, skill, and careful preparation could provide safety for people who were willing to adapt to new realities. The lessons I'd learned about patience, observation, and respect for natural forces were more valuable than ever in a world where civilization's protection had been stripped away. In 24 hours, I'd learned that everything I thought I knew about survival was both completely wrong and more important than I'd ever imagined. The forest didn't just hide me from the infected. It made me stronger, more capable, and better able to protect the people who were depending on me for their lives. The outbreak had ended the world I'd known, but it had also revealed capabilities and purpose that I'd never suspected I possessed. This was just the first 24 hours of a crisis that would reshape everything about human existence. What happened in the weeks and months that followed would determine whether survivors like the Morrison family and myself could preserve enough of civilization to rebuild something worth passing on to children like Tommy and Lisa. The infected were terrifying, but they were just the beginning of challenges that would test every aspect of human adaptability and determination. The world had ended, but we were still alive, still capable of learning and growing and caring for each other. In a universe that had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous, that was more than we had any right to hope for. And it was enough to build on if we were smart, careful, and determined to prove that humanity was more than just another species that could be driven to extinction by circumstances beyond its control.